Welcome to HP at Church, a podcast about Harry Potter and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her.
In this episode, we'll discuss the Easter Vigil, an ancient practice in the Christian church that takes place the night before or early morning of Easter. The tradition comes from the idea of staying up late with the disciples, though my favorite way of doing Easter Vigil is to do it as a sunrise service, so that we are up early with the women, the first witnesses of the resurrection. The readings we're using come from the suggested readings that the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America uses. Not all of the readings are required, and other Easter Vigil suggestions use other readings, so you may experience different ones if you are worshiping with a different congregation. A couple content notifications for this episode. One is that scattered throughout this episode, we mention a few different times Harry's treatment by the Dursleys, and in particular, the way that Dumbledore sets Harry up to die, kind of along the lines of child sacrifice. We also, in Ezekiel 36, the first of the Ezekiel readings, talk about imperialism and world domination.
We'd also like to acknowledge that the world is going through a lot of changes right now, as we face a global pandemic. This is the first episode we've recorded since the full impact of COVID-19 has started to become clear in the U.S. We want you to know that we are praying for all of our listeners, and especially for those on the front lines of this crisis. But we are also enjoying the many signs of hope we see among us. Humanity is pulling together and helping each other in big and small ways that the trio would be proud of. And watching the church explore new ways to be church in a time of physical distancing is exciting.
Especially for podcasters.
Absolutely.
If you want to follow along on our blog, it's hpatchurch, hpatchurch.wordpress.com. And you can find links to the Bible passages we're using and more information on other references we make in this episode.
Also, if you appreciate what we do, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/hpatchurch. Not only do you get access to special content, but you'll also be helping us to be more accessible and sustainable as a podcast, which is important to us, since not everybody has a quick quotes quill to help them.
As we begin our readings for this Easter Vigil, the first reading is from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 4a. In the first of the creation accounts in Genesis, God creates all that is and then concludes that the work done is good, and it is time for rest. So, a major theme in this passage is creation care or stewardship, and credit where credit is due. I got this from one of my housemates and colleagues, Reverend Nikira, but they talked about the ways that humans are created with the ability to think ahead, to plan, and that gives us the power to also steward creation, to care for creation. In this passage, the word dominion is used, and there's different ways we can think about it. So the way that we're thinking about it with steward and the way that Pastor Nikira talks about it is not the way Voldemort or Fudge think about dominion, where it's just absolute authority without any responsibility or accountability, but instead is a way of caring for creation, of thinking ahead about how what we do in this moment will impact all of creation. So then the connection that Pastor Nikira made was that for witches, magic gives an extra amount of power to that. And so there are extra ways to care for creation and to think about how magic then gives the power of magic gives the magical community new ways to better care for creation instead of dominating it, which we don't see played out in the books very much, but I think it would be amazing to think about the spells that could be cast to limit the need for electricity or to limit the pollution that happens. I think there's all sorts of magical solutions for it, but there's also non-magical solutions that we can make as humans because we do have the ability to think ahead. We're not great at it given the way our politics works, but we have that power for sure.
Okay, I am in love with the idea of figuring out how to use magic to prevent pollution and the many, many charms that you could use instead of having to power something with the electricity that was produced by coal or that kind of thing. Absolutely.
Right? It would be amazing. I mean, even think about the Weasley's car, right? It probably doesn't use any gas.
Right.
Like, it just runs on magic.
Or, ooh, hey, that could be Hermione's new job. When she's not busy being Minister of Magic. She could form a company that, like, invents, air quotes here, I know you can't see them, a type of technology that manages to create energy and electricity in ways that no one else can understand because they're just not smart enough for it. And therefore, they manage to camouflage magic in the non-magical friendly world.
That's brilliant. Also, I think in this, the Harry Potter Alliance has a campaign that's Hermione running for president, which is like all sorts of complicated. But this is one of the things that like actually I think Hermione would care a lot about and would be pretty good at.
Is one of the parts of her platform that once she becomes president, she'll make it legal for someone who's not a natural-born citizen to be president?
Probably not.
Hi, Jessie. One of our very favorite podcast guests.
Yes.
But Jessie and Maggie will never meet because that would be bad.
That would be super bad. Not to be confused with the movie Superbad. Anyway, as we dive into this great story of creation, it starts out, as many great stories do, almost with once upon a time, but instead in the beginning. And the way it begins just sounds like this beautiful storytelling. And I think that's part of what this story is, right? The stories are meant to be stories that give meaning to the world and to help us understand the world. They're not meant to be, history textbooks. And so I love the way this story, even from the beginning, sounds like a story that could be in the Tales of Beedle the Bard, right? It sounds like the way Hermione reads the tale of the three brothers in Deathly Hallows. Particularly, I love the movie version of this, but just that you're telling a story that gives meaning, that's also like just a story.
Sure. I read the first verse, and I immediately thought, in the beginning, when Ms. Rowling created Harry and Hogwarts, and that was kind of a warm, fuzzy moment. And it made me think about the beginning of Harry Potter fandom. I discovered the Harry Potter books and read them for the first time just after the third book came out and while we were waiting for book 4. And I have to say that the Harry Potter fandom has definitely changed a lot since the days when we just had the first few books and people were really creative and had different ideas of making up how the story might work out and how the world building might go. I'm not saying we're not creative now, but there's so much more established now that there's less room to play around with.
Yeah.
I think there's something special to a fandom when the canon is still unfinished and you still have all that imagination room to work in. And I really loved that. So.
Yeah. I still go back to different fandom, or not fandoms, but like fan fiction. And some of my favorites are the ones where it's before Sirius or just an alternate universe one.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just so much creativity. It's beautiful. In verse 3, when God says, "Let there be light," of course, I couldn't help but think of Dumbledore's Deluminator and the ways that it both takes away light and gives light to wherever it may be. Even when there are no lamps or candles, it's still like in the jail/dungeon of the Malfoy Manor, when Ron uses the Deluminator, it just has like little balls of light in like the corners of the dungeon.
Yep. And then when we reach verse 3 in chapter 2, a chapter later, I was thinking about how after the war was over, rest for Hermione looked like going back to Hogwarts and finishing her studies. But for Harry and Ron, it looked like going to Aurora School and getting on with their lives. And I wonder if any of their classmates took an actual vacation at that point. Like, somebody, I would hope, those poor kids, got to take an actual vacation. And also, as a side note, I would love to see the story of Hermione's 7th year and coming into her own as a separate person without Harry and Ron being around.
That would be amazing. You know she's head girl.
Yeah. In fact, I kind of think that maybe there wouldn't be a head boy. Like, maybe it's just Hermione, because...
I actually was thinking, because then she'd be in the same year as Ginny. And so if Ginny went that year, they could both be head girls.
Yes.
You know they would
Hermione
rock
would
it.
be super head girl. And, yeah.
That would be amazing. Yeah. I nominate you to write that fanfiction.
In my copious free time, yes.
Yep.
Our next reading is also from Genesis and skips around a little bit, so stay with me while I say this. Genesis chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, and verses 11 through 18. Genesis chapter 8, verses 6 through 18. And Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 13.
Not complicated at all.
No, that'll be fine. This is why we have links on our blog that link you straight to the readings so that you don't have to do the skipping around. You can just read them. Mm-hmm. The story of Noah, Noah's family, and the ark they survived the flood in is completed with God's covenant with humanity, symbolized by the rainbow.
So a theme that I picked up on in this is repentance and a new covenant or a new promise. In this story, at the end, part of what the bow symbolizes is God being like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't do that again. Maybe that wasn't the best plan. So I'm going to put this reminder in the sky for myself, right? It's not a reminder for humanity. It's a reminder for God that God doesn't want to destroy all of humanity save one family again. And so there's this repentance from the one with the power. And I think I am frequently the one to say, Dumbledore is not the one with is like not supposed to be God, and we need to not compare Dumbledore to God. But here I am comparing Dumbledore to God.
We've done that before, once or twice.
We've done it before. I try to avoid it a lot. But I think it's helpful in this case because it shows the contrast of how and why Dumbledore is not God. Because what would it have looked like if Dumbledore had repented and had tried to make a new plan or a new promise with Harry that didn't involve Harry dying for the sake of all of the magical world, right? What if Dumbledore had truly repented of raising this child as a sheep led to slaughter?
Yeah. In chapter 7, verse 11, we read that the windows of the heavens were opened and then the rain fell out of them. Wait, what? Shouldn't it be more like the sump pump of the basement of heaven was opened? Since when does rain fall out of windows? That does not... that is
falls
not how...
in through windows.
Well, yes, exactly.
But,
it can fall through a window. But, yeah, if you open a window, rain doesn't automatically fall out of it. That does not compute.
I mean, to be fair, I don't think they had sump pumps back then.
Well, probably not, no. But, open the moat of heaven or something, I don't know.
The moat of heaven.
But rain can, of course, fall through windows, as Emily pointed out, except maybe at Hogwarts, where I would hope that there would be all kinds of spells on the windows to keep the rain out and to keep, say, the students from falling out of the windows, even if, like Neville, they might bounce.
It's possible, but who knows? In chapter 7, verse 17, we hear that the flood continued 40 days on the earth, and the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. And it reminded me of a different sort of flooding of waters and windows, but in the Death Eater's office in Deathly Hallows at the Ministry of Magic, in Yaxley's office, where somebody charmed the office to just rain inside the room, and then Ron gets stuck as Mr. Cattermole trying to figure out how to end the charm, and so that because they're trying his wife for being a Muggleborn, but just that idea of that one room just flooding over and over.
In chapter 9, verse 11, this rule is what I call a rule written in blood, which means that the rule exists because something specific happened, and it needs to not happen again. And God promises not to destroy humanity or the earth with a flood ever again. If you read the rule, it's specifically with a flood. God does not actually promise to not destroy the earth ever again, period.
Well, that's not comforting, okay?
It turns out, strangely enough, that a lot of the Bible isn't comforting if you read it closely, but that a lot of the Bible still is. Life is more difficult than, the bumper stickers of the world would tell you. But the reason why God makes this specific promise is because God sort of tried to do that once, mostly. Kind of like how I imagine that after Harry and Ron's second year, Hogwarts probably had a rule about not flying cars to get to Hogwarts. But do they have a rule about flying a pickup truck?
Some Ravenclaw is going to fly a pickup truck and then try to get around that rule by saying, well, it just had a flying car. Ravenclaws. So smart. As we continue in verses 12 and 13 of chapter 9, the way it's stated is that God puts a bow in the heavens as the reminder. And I was thinking about it in two different ways, kind of. One is the rainbow as God's remember all, where it's like every time God sees it, it's like, oh, there's a thing I have to remember. What is it? What is it? What is it? Oh, right. Don't destroy humanity in a flood. Okay, got it. So God might be a little bit better at remembering what it is God forgets than Neville, but I also was thinking about it because the bow is like, the bow that they're talking about is not like the bow that you might put in your hair, but a bow like a bow and arrow kind of bow. And so I was thinking about Harry Potter and where Gryffindor's sword ends up,
yes.
Right? Because Gryffindor's sword is a big symbol in the battle against Voldemort, especially because it comes back. They use it, it gets taken. They use it, it gets taken. And then but it keeps coming back. And like Neville gets to use it and stuff. And so where did they end up then putting Gryffindor's sword? Like, is there a place where they put it where it is a symbol of, is it part of kind of the memorial that they make to the people who died in the Battle of Hogwarts?
Sure. Or for that matter, is it on display or is it ready to be used again to defend the school as necessary?
Right, but I want it to be on display as a reminder of the pain and the violence and the desire not to do that again.
Right.
Because that, if they needed it, just throw on the hat and it'll disappear off that thing and come back ready to use again.
I kind of thought that the sword was, actually inside the hat when Harry pulled it out. Not that the hat fetched it for him.
No, the hat fetches it.
Okay.
Yeah, because Harry puts the hat on his head and is like, I need help. And then there's a tight squeeze and then a thunk on his head.
Right. I guess I always figured that, the sword was magically shrunken or something, and...
Oh.
Yeah.
I never thought that.
Okay. Also...
I guess it's possible, because Hermione does it with the purse, but...
Yes. If the rainbow is God's bow, bow and arrow, what kind of arrows does God shoot? Cupid shoots arrows of love, but if it's a rainbow bow, then I would have to think that the arrows God is shooting is,
Makes people queer. Yes!
Just spreading love and joy throughout the land, that kind of thing.
Our next reading is Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 18. Abraham wins the prizes of most loyal to God and worst father ever by showing himself as willing to murder his kid if God wants him to, until God stops him.
I would just like to point out that summarizing some of these readings is not as easy as you might think, for the record.
It's true. Kay does a wonderful job of summarizing these readings. I actually really love this one. So a theme for this one is, as we kind of talked about at the beginning, these stories are stories that are not necessarily history book stories, but stories that tell about the struggles that people face. And so this one is kind of wrestling with mythology and theology. So I know in the past I've heard, and I can't cite you where, though it might actually be from fiction, the idea of this story is that it's the transition for the culture and for the community from a place where child sacrifice was normative into a place where child sacrifice is wrong. So it's a way of depicting that transition of cultural and theological beliefs. And so I was thinking about that sort of wrestling that people were doing in that time and the wrestling that we do as Harry Potter fans with J.K. Rowling's turfdom, and also with the things in the books that are problematic. So the way that goblins, centaurs, and werewolves are all stand-ins for like actual categories of people. Goblins are like stand-ins for Jewish people in problematic ways, and centaurs are stand-ins for Native people in problematic ways, and werewolves are stand-ins for people with HIV in problematic ways. And so just thinking about how we wrestle with those. And I will throw a shout out here for Witch Please, the podcast has mostly completed its term, but the episodes are still available, and it is one of the best podcasts in terms of doing that wrestling and kind of critical thinking. They call themselves a feminist critical reading of Harry Potter, and I really love them. So we'll include links in the blog.
When we reach verse 2, this is where Abraham gets the actual instruction from God that makes the story so extraordinary. And I think this is also where you can tell that clearly Abraham has never worked in fast food, because he has obviously never learned a cardinal rule of always repeat the order back to make sure you have it right. I've got to tell you, God instructs people to do some pretty extraordinary things, but I think repeating the order back to make sure you have it right is perfectly reasonable. I mean, among the many things about Abraham that irritate me in this story, one of them is that he doesn't even bother double-checking.
He's just
that
like,
is a very low bar that you just did not reach, man.
Well, and if you, like, read it back, sometimes that's the point where people are like, oh, that would, like, maybe that would have been the point where God's like, oh, that doesn't sound right.
Or maybe, like, repeating it back was enough of questioning for Abraham to pass the test, because I've also definitely heard the theory that Abraham not sacrificing Isaac was Abraham passing the test. And it reminds me of Harry asking Hagrid to repeat himself when he's told that he's a wizard for the first time. I mean, he's 11, he's in a shack with his abusive family members, and this random gigantic dude breaks through the front door and tells him he's a wizard. I think asking him to repeat himself is a reasonable option.
Yeah, like, what? This doesn't seem
Could you
real.
say that again? Because I might have had water in my ear. There's a lot of rain going on. Yeah.
Well, and I think in verse 2 and a couple other verses, I was struck by how way that God even phrases this is a selectivist or revisionist history, right? God says, your son, your only son, Isaac. Well,
yeah, that's not true.
Abraham has 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael. And so it's just like, God.
And both of them were sent by God, like, specifically.
Yeah. And so then I was thinking about, like, Slughorn's memory of Tom Riddle when he asks about Horcruxes. And that one is a super obvious revision. And I think that this is a super obvious revision, too, for anyone who actually knows, like, the stories in Genesis. You can't know the stories in Genesis and not know that Abraham has 2 sons, Isaac and Ishmael. And in fact, Ishmael's older.
Yeah.
Or a more subtle revisionist history, right, is the magical world's account of history with the goblins.
Right.
According to the magical world, the goblins are always at fault. According to the goblins, the magical world's always at fault. And we tell the stories that we know, and we tell the stories from our perspective, and usually it's the winners who tell the stories, so it's not always a fair accounting.
When we reach verse 9, I'm betting that there was a whole lot of conversation between the 2 sentences that make up this verse that we never get to hear. The part between the setting up of the altar and Abraham actually binding Isaac and putting him on the altar. That sounds like
how does he bind Isaac
of the story
and Isaac doesn't know?
Yeah, unless there is some, like, really interesting lassoing going on that, I mean, Abraham was a cattle rancher, so I suppose being able to lasso might be within the reasonable amount of his skills.
I guess, but I bet Isaac and Ishmael probably played at that and knew how to get out of that.
Yeah.
Growing up.
Yeah, so, like, how that whole thing went down, I have a feeling that there is a large chunk of the story that we're missing. If this actually happened, of course, which we're, theorizing that it might not have. But it reminds me, in the Harry Potter world, of how we never actually get to hear how James convinced Lily, presumably over the course of a few years there, that he was good enough to marry after being such a get to her for so many years.
I also keyed in on verse 9 and verse 10 and thinking about the different roles of the characters and how different things happened, to thinking about if Dumbledore was Abraham to Harry's Isaac/Ishmael. So for Muslims, Ishmael is the son who was taken, not Isaac. And how that plays out, that it really, like, that's a real good example of, like, it's a really good parallel story, because Abraham is ready to kill his son and Dumbledore is ready to kill Harry, or to let Harry die, and it's through other interventions that Harry and Isaac or Ishmael live. But then also thinking about perspective and, like, what was Isaac thinking during all of this, right? Which kind of came up in what you were saying, Kay. But
yeah,
what is going on? Abraham's just like, okay, Isaac, everything's set. Now I'm going to bind you. And Isaac's just like, okay. Doesn't seem reasonable. But we only get kind of Abraham's account of the story. And so I was thinking about, in the Harry Potter books, we mostly get Harry's account of the story, but particularly in the graveyard in Goblet of Fire, I was just curious, like, what Pettigrew was thinking, right? Like, there's so much fear for Pettigrew in that, in all of his interactions from Prisoner of Azkaban on, but particularly in that graveyard, right? Like, he's serving, the only one left for him to serve, because he betrayed his friends and they will not have him back and they will not protect him. But also, like, he's having to relive the biggest betrayal of his life with Harry right in front of him, and, like, his own loss of his hand and all of those complexities.
You know, come to think of it, among the many, many differences between Harry Potter and the Bible, and there are oodles, is that with Harry, we always know exactly how old he is in every story. With the Bible, not so much. And I'm wondering, how old is Isaac in this story? Like, is he 4 or is he 14?
We know he can talk and in complete sentences.
Yes. So he might be 5, but he might also be 15.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a whole world of difference between, you know, binding a 5-year-old and binding, or being prepared to sacrifice either of them. It really doesn't, if it's your kid, that's still incredibly terrifying. But I don't know, I think there's a difference between a 5-year-old and a 15-year-old in some ways for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Shall we move on? Our next reading for the Easter Vigil is from Exodus, chapter 14, verses 10 through 31, and chapter 15, verses 20 and 21. God brings the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, instructing Moses to part the Red Sea so they can cross safely on the dry seabed beneath. And the prophet Miriam leads the celebration for deliverance.
So, theme that I noticed for this passage was the theme of celebration. So we hear of the prophet Miriam leading the community in a song and in celebration for making it through the Red Sea and for making it away from the Egyptians whom God has now killed. And it reminded me not only of the many celebrations in the Gryffindor common room after Quidditch wins and Triwizard Tournament tasks and stuff, but also in Order of the Phoenix after Harry's trial in front of the Wizengamot, when he's found not guilty and he comes home and they're all celebrating, and I think it's Ginny and the twins are, like, dancing around and chanting about Harry being free, that he got off. And so it's just this, that's kind of what's in my mind with Miriam leading the community. But also, as we talk about and think about Miriam, I was struck by her being named as a prophet. And I think she's the first prophet in the Bible, because that story is so early on in the history of the Hebrew people, the Israelites. It's before any of the books of the prophets. And so to have Miriam be the first prophet, who then, of course, gets ignored, and her role has definitely been minimized over time. And so I was thinking about, like, the ways that happens all over the place. I mean, look at Gryffindor and Slytherin, who are the two about whom the most is known and told and shared, for better and for worse. While Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff, both women, were also founders, were also really powerful, and yet get ignored and left out of the stories. They just, like, happen to be there, while Gryffindor and Slytherin are doing all the impressive things.
Well, and let's be honest, Gryffindor and Slytherin were busy having their little rivalry, and I'm willing to bet that Ravenclaw set up the curriculum and that Hufflepuff is the one who figured out how to actually feed the students and make sure there were enough beds for everybody. And, they were busy doing work, and Gryffindor and Slytherin were, busy yelling at each other.
It's true, unless you follow the story that is told in our D&D game, which is that Gryffindor and Slytherin are actually a couple and in love, and there's a prophecy that if they get married, that's what turns Slytherin to the dark side. We're right now trying to, counter the prophecy and keep it from happening, but we're not sure how.
If Slytherin turns to the dark side, will he slaughter all the younglings?
Not that kind of turning to the dark side, though I did just watch that episode 3 of Star Wars with my friend with whom I do river reviews. As we dive into this passage in chapter 14, verses 11 through 12, the Israelites are complaining to Moses, and they say, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." The Israelites just sound like Aberforth at the end of Deathly Hallows when the trio arrive at the Hogshead, and they're talking to Aberforth, and he's just like, "All is lost. You should be hiding and trying to live out your life while Voldemort takes over everything. There is no hope." And that's just feels like where the Israelites are. And this is just the beginning of their journey, right? Because then it's 40 years in the wilderness. Just a long time.
I hope Moses had a good therapist.
I hope so too. I don't think he does yet, but he does set up some elders to help. Yeah, eventually after the golden calf and stuff.
When his father-in-law tells him to.
Right.
When we reach chapter 14, verse 16, Moses lifts his staff, and I have to wonder, did he hold his hand out over it and say "up" in a loud, confident voice? And did it maybe take a couple tries the first time?
And then did he take off flying and just fly everybody over the Red Sea?
Or, just to keep an eye on everybody and make sure they didn't get lost. No, there's really only this one path through the Red Sea. Please don't turn left. Please stop turning left, Fred. Fred?
There's water there. You can't go in. Yeah. Well, and I was thinking of the part at the end of that, right, where Moses stretches out his hand over the sea and the sea returns to the normal depth. And that reminded me of all of the many times, but particularly in Book 5, after the trio have visited Hagrid when he gets back from the Giants, and after Umbridge has come to visit him, when they're on their way back, and Hermione is, following behind in the invisibility cloak, erasing their path, erasing the evidence that they were there. And she does that, I think, in a lot in Deathly Hallows also, but that particular one where it's okay, let's make it look like nothing's there. Granted, when Moses does it, then, dead Egyptians come up on the seashore, but... Yeah. It's a little... Yeah.
So what you're saying is that Hermione was better than Moses at that.
Hermione also didn't have to cover up dead bodies.
Well, that time. And then when we reach chapter 14, verse 31, so the sea has already parted, and they've already walked on the dry seabed across it. But it's only because the sea fell back in on the Egyptians that they believe in God and Moses. Really? Which is repeated in verse 21 of chapter 15, when Miriam praises God specifically for killing the Egyptians rather than for saving the people, which supposedly again and again and again is what throughout the Hebrew scriptures God is praised for from this story. That God saved the people, not so much that God killed a bunch of Egyptians. And I have to wonder, because I really think this must have happened at some point in Harry's life, that I wonder how Harry would have reacted if someone ever tried to praise him specifically for killing Voldemort, rather than for ending the war or being willing to die to save others or for all the work he did to defeat Voldemort.
I think most of the praise he was going to get is for killing Voldemort.
Right. But I don't think that never really seemed to be his goal. He wanted to defeat Voldemort. He wanted to make sure that Voldemort didn't hurt anyone. But, the actual killing part was not really what he was pointed toward.
Yeah. I could see him, trying to, redirect or correct people a little bit and then just, eventually giving up because too many people were too set on
Or possibly having a giant blow-up. If
That interpretation.
this happened while he was young enough, yeah.
Also that. Yeah.
In public.
He's in the middle
Screaming
of
at
horror
a
training.
giant crowd while receiving an award.
He would do it right at award time.
Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Or like at his wedding reception.
Yeah. Our next reading is Isaiah chapter 55, verses 1 through 11. The prophet Isaiah proclaims the covenant that God has made with us and what it looks like compared to our usual lives. So the theme is abundance. This covenant with God is a covenant of abundance, and I think every time when I think of abundance, the Weasleys are always the best example of this. That no matter what else is happening in their lives, no matter their economic situation, there will always be an abundance of food at the table for everyone who is there. There will always be a welcome place for anyone who is there, whether they're at Grimmauld Place or at the Burrow. It is so much the heart of that family and the way that that family expresses love, and particularly Mrs. Weasley. It's just beautiful.
Yeah. When we jump into the text, in verse 1, I have to admit that I was raised on classic musicals in a big way, and so this verse immediately reminds me of Brigadoon, the scene when Gene Kelly and Van Johnson actually enter Brigadoon for the first time, and the bridegroom of the day winds up offering them food for free because he's getting married. But it also makes me think of the Great Hall at Hogwarts, which is the first place where Harry was able to eat until he was full, as far as we can tell, in his life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was thinking about the offer for Hogwarts, especially around food as well, that as long as you get into Hogwarts, you get in no matter how much money you have, and you get food. You get fed.
Yeah. No school lunch debt at Hogwarts.
Yeah. No school lunch debt, no purchasing books debt. Right. Now, if you are as proud and stubborn as the Weasleys, you might not take advantage of that or use that money, but it doesn't mean that it's not available.
Yeah.
Everybody gets free lunch. I think everybody should get free lunch anyway, but...
There is such a thing as a free lunch.
True.
When we reach verse 7, we hear that with God there is always room for true forgiveness and pardon. But as we've talked about before on this podcast, with the Harry Potter crew, that's a little less likely. They try sometimes, but it feels kind of like with the Harry Potter world, in order to be truly forgiven and completely pardoned and not have it thrown in your face every day for the rest of your life, it feels like you have to have been really super trustworthy already before. Like, say, Ron. I believe that Ron gets fully forgiven for him leaving and coming back. I can see that, but in Book 7. But other characters, I don't know.
Even with Ron, it takes a while, though.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Absolutely. Forgiveness takes work. Forgiveness is work. Yeah, I don't think they actually succeed in it very often, and let's be honest, Harry can hold a grudge with the best of them. So
that is true.
I don't actually blame him for most of his grudges. That's fine, but still.
Yeah. Well, and in verse 8, I was thinking about the way that God's perspective is stated in comparison to human perspective, right? That God will abundantly pardon, for God's thoughts are not our thoughts, and nor are our ways God's ways. And there's this call out of the fear and scarcity with which people were living, a call into abundance, which we see throughout this passage. And I think about it with Deathly Hallows, the way that Potter Watch calls people not just to protect themselves, but to protect particularly their Muggle neighbors who are more vulnerable to being harmed by magic. And I think about it right now as we think about COVID-19 and compassionate distancing, physical distancing, and washing hands, not worshiping in person. All of these are ways that we are called to care for our neighbors, right? It's not, for those of us who aren't immunocompromised, it's not about protecting ourselves. It's about making sure we're caring for those who are more susceptible, more vulnerable to getting COVID-19 and having it be a life-threatening illness.
Yeah, it's not about are you going to survive if you catch it. It's about are you going to carry it to someone who won't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So keep physical distancing and keep joining us in the virtual world for what it means to be church.
Yep. Our next reading is from Proverbs chapter 8, verses 1 through 8, verses 19 through 21, and chapter 9, verse 4b through 6. Lady Wisdom calls us to learn from her.
an obvious theme in Proverbs and with Lady Wisdom is wisdom.
No, really?
I know, it's amazing. We hear the way that wisdom is characterized in this passage really reminds me of Minerva McGonagall and how she exists in the Harry Potter world, in the magical world. The way that she calls people to prudence and to wisdom, particularly thinking of her advice to Harry in Order of the Phoenix when she's like, okay, but is it prudent for you to continue to insist to Umbridge, who works for the Minister of Magic, that Voldemort is back? Like, that may be true. Is it prudent? And so that sort of wisdom that she carries with her. But also, as I was thinking about wisdom and knowledge and understanding and the complexities of those and the ways that those aren't necessarily the same thing, I was thinking about Luna, who has this really deep wisdom that is not necessarily truth or knowledge, or maybe it's a deeper knowledge that's not always wise or true. I don't know. Like there's a characteristic about Luna that is just this depth of knowledge of the world. I don't know, like she's an old soul.
Yeah.
I think. And then as we dive into the passage in verses 2 and 3, we hear that Lady Wisdom is on the heights beside the way. At the crossroads she takes her stand. Beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portals, she cries out. That she locates herself in all of these prominent gathering points for the community. So I was thinking about, like, if she were at Hogwarts, she'd be at the Clock Tower courtyard, or in the Great Hall, or at the Three Broomsticks, or in the common rooms, in all of those places,
or
to
maybe
make sure
even the
that
library.
the message got shared. No, because Madam Pince would kick her out.
In chapter 8, verse 5, we hear that wisdom for those who are not as bright as others or perhaps just uninformed basically adds up to being prudent. And the modern day example that comes to mind is like how with the pandemic at this point, the advice is to act as though you already have been infected yourself and act accordingly. And that way you will probably be able to keep other people safe. And that's a lesson, the idea of being prudent when in doubt, that's a lesson that might have saved Crabbe's life.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, you don't have to be terribly well-informed or terribly bright in order to understand that starting fiend fire in a crowded room is probably not the world's greatest plan.
In a room full of flammable
stuff,
junk.
Yeah.
Crabbe the Imprudent is perhaps the title he would earn himself.
If there's a portrait of him anywhere, I'm sure that's what it's labeled. Yeah. And then in chapter 8, verse 21, we hear that the wise become rich, and I have to say I'm not really sure I buy that. Do the wise become rich? Like, Nicholas Flamel seems to be doing okay, but he's also had several hundred years, but that's also because he's wise, so I don't know, that kind of goes back and forth. But,
that's from his knowledge more than his wisdom, I think.
Well, yeah, there's that too. Like, I'm not really sure using the Philosopher's Stone is particularly wise at all.
Yeah.
But there are lots of people in the Harry Potter world who are wise, who do not seem terribly rich. And that's, like, I'm not sure that it's wise to become rich at all. Goodness knows, we've seen enough of what it does to people, and especially these days.
Yeah, I don't think it's wise to be rich.
Yeah, that, like, you know, wise to be financially stable? Sure. Wise to be able to help others? Absolutely. Wise to, you know, be a billionaire in a world where there are lots of people who can't eat or seek medical help for simple things? No.
I think wisdom has to have a component of compassion. And you cannot be a billionaire.
A component of compassion I am totally up for, but just in terms of your own best self-interest, if there's a revolution, there's going to be a select group of people who are going to be first up against the wall, and frankly, the billionaires are not terribly well liked. So, self-preservation too. But yeah, I am not making any direct threats to anyone. Murder is bad. I continue on the theme of murder is bad, but still.
Yeah.
So yeah, I hate to question the Bible. Wait, no, I don't. But I'm not sure I buy this verse as a proverb. That doesn't really seem to go.
Yeah. Well, and I think rich in the times of Proverbs was very different than rich right now.
Oh goodness, yes.
Like, there is still a stratification in people who were rich and people who were poor, but not to nearly the same extent as it is today.
Although I suppose they might have had people who had multiple yachts.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. As we move into chapter 9 in this passage, in verses 5 and 6, Again, it just sounds like Hogwarts. Like, what if Hogwarts' mission is only partly teaching, and the other part of Hogwarts' mission is actually feeding people, feeding the magical children? That would at least partly explain the hashtag failed pedagogy at Hogwarts, at least a little bit.
They're not failing at everything.
Yeah, if their main focus isn't just teaching, but also caring for and feeding. I guess they kind of fail at the caring for part too because of all of the
Hagrid tries.
chances for people to die. But the feeding, they do that well.
And that's the house elves. Also, if feeding is actually part of their mission, then that would make the house elves faculty, wouldn't it?
Are the house elves faculty?
I don't think you can technically call them staff if they're not paid.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
Interesting. Who knows?
On the other hand, there are plenty of faculty who know what it's like to not be paid a living wage.
Also true. Our next passage is Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 24 through 28. God promises to gather the Israelites together and to change their hearts and spirit. So one of the main themes for this passage is renewal. God is renewing the Israelites, the people of Israel. And so I was thinking about renewal in the books, and there's always the every new year is a new year, and so there's renewal at the beginning of each book and each school year. But also in Prisoner of Azkaban, the movie, there's a great visual of the changing of the seasons with the Whomping Willow, and so there's this space for renewal where there's a depiction of the Whomping Willow with snow all over it, and then it just shakes off all the snow, and that is the signal that it's becoming springtime, that life is returning to the earth.
Yeah.
And then in verse 24, God says to the people, I will take you from the nations and gather you from all the countries and bring you into your own land. And it got me thinking and wondering about who will gather the Muggleborns from afar after the Second Voldemort, right? First off, why are they staying in the UK? Why didn't Dean Thomas and Ted Tonks and all of them just leave the UK? They've got magic, they could do it. But then, for those who were smart enough to do that, or wise enough perhaps, why, who's gonna go tell them the worst is over? What does the rest of the magical world even know about what Voldemort is doing? Why have they not helped out? Where is the world in this?
Yeah. I mean, also, just because you're going through terrible things doesn't mean you're ready to leave your home.
That's true. I mean, this actually just now made me think about, Syria and the response.
Refugees, yeah.
Right, and refugees, and some are leaving, and some are not leaving, and some can leave, and some can't leave. And also, the international world is not responding and helping, especially in the U.S. We've been so caught up in our own political games that...
We missed the fact the pandemic was coming?
Well, we missed the fact the pandemic is coming, but we also, didn't show up for the people of Syria the way that we could have.
Yeah.
We didn't have thoughtful conversations about what it looks like to intervene and to help and support people who are being oppressed.
Yeah.
Much more frequently in this country, we are the oppressor more than we are the helper of the oppressed.
In verse 25, on a lighter note, I know that this isn't what this verse is talking about, but I've got to say, if a wizard could or a witch could invent this potion, it sounds really useful. Imagine being able to sprinkle a couple of drops of a potion on yourself, and suddenly you're entirely fresh and clean like you were just out of the shower. Very handy, especially while traveling.
So
I love
fresh
that
and
idea.
so clean. There's a song. Yes, it would be great to be suddenly fresh and clean like I was out of the shower. That'd be super handy. I would love that. Be especially handy these days.
Yeah.
Wouldn't have to wash. For folks who work in hospitals, you wouldn't have to take a shower immediately upon entering your home every day.
Yeah.
Well, and in verses 25 and 26, as I was reading it, I was thinking about the heart of stone turned to a heart of flesh, and that's in the end, and this is spoilers for Cursed Child, but in the end, that's what happens in Cursed Child, that Harry still hasn't dealt with or come to terms with his parents' death, even as he learned so much more about it throughout the Harry Potter books. It was still this stone thing, this stuck thing for him. And so in Cursed Child, he actually re-experiences his parents' death in a way that there's potential for changing it, but every time it tries to be changed, it doesn't go well. And the difference is that this time he has his whole community surrounding him. And so when he experiences it, it becomes a fleshy thing. It becomes a thing where he has the emotional support and the communal support to grieve and to actually feel what he couldn't feel when he was 1 year old and what he couldn't feel as he was like being raised to die and to fight Voldemort. So there's just this beauty of the fleshiness of grief, I think.
Yeah. And then in verse 27, this verse, on the other hand, sounds a lot like the complete removal of free will, much like the Imperius curse, which wouldn't have been a good thing even if it was Dumbledore's people who were using it. Although...
Like when Harry uses it to get into Gringotts?
Yeah, for example. Though when you read this verse in context with the previous verses, it sounds more like being transformed into the kind of person who would want to do all these things anyway. But it still kind of sounds like the removal of free will, so it's a little fuzzy.
Yeah. And now it's time for a word from our sponsors. The Easter Vigil tells the stories of our faith that we go back to again and again. So our word from our sponsors, aka us, is the stories we return to again and again. In Harry Potter, in the Bible, and in this podcast.
I think for me, the story that I return to regularly in Harry Potter is Hermione and Mr. Weasley in the forest talking about people who are nice to their house elves, even when no one's looking. I've returned to that one many, many times. I don't know about returning to other stories in Harry Potter constantly, although I certainly have a habit of making remarks at the end of my comments on a verse like, right, Dumbledore? Or that kind of thing, but I don't think that really is the same thing. And then when it comes to in the Bible, I think it feels like lately the two stories that I keep coming back to are Mary Magdalene as the first female apostle, the first apostle at all sent out to proclaim the gospel. And also it seems like not the last couple of weeks, I guess, because we've been busy with other things. But before then, it felt like I was quoting Matthew 5:29, which is the gouge your eye out if you're looking at a person lustfully verse. It felt like I was quoting that a lot for a little while there. And
admittedly, it was one of the readings.
Yes, that is true. But also, amazing how often that comes up in real life. So, yeah, I think those are the stories I suppose I've been returning to often, although actually my favorite story in the Bible is still the woman with the hemorrhage, which I guess I don't get to return to as often as I would like.
I think I return, and Kay, maybe you can help me with this. I was trying to think of, I think I return a lot to Order of the Phoenix, and there's a way in which, the stories between Umbridge and, the relationship between Umbridge and Harry is a frequent go-to for me, particularly in the context of our podcast, that I keep going back to, in that, resistance to an oppressor. But, we've talked about it today in the context of, McGonagall's advice to Harry and stuff.
Yes. I would also suggest that you do love to talk about Dobby, and you also love to talk about Hermione and the house elves in relation to Dobby.
It's true. That was the other one that came to mind, was, the house elves and the ways that Hermione is super, white feministy with SPEW, but also the way, thinking critically about house elves and how they're portrayed and what liberation for house elves looks like. And we just encountered an elf in our D&D campaign, and it's right when the nobles, the magical nobles, have come and cursed all the elves except for this one to come and to want to come and serve them. And so that's another piece of our D&D campaign, which I will circle back to after I talk about the Bible. Yeah, so I think that's part of it. But then in the Bible, I think my favorite is the Syrophoenician woman in Mark, or the Canaanite woman in Matthew. I think that story just has so much richness to it. And it was the Mark version was the gospel for my ordination. And so that's a particularly powerful one for me. But I also returned to Psalm 139 a lot, which was the psalm for my ordination. But just the ways that God creates us in love, and then the ways that we get to become co-creators with God of who we are and how we're and how we bear God's image and how we share God's love in the world. So those are kind of my main two, and especially as a chaplain, I serve the NICU, so neonatal intensive care unit, and the pregnancy, labor, delivery floors, and Psalm 139 is a big one that I use a lot on those floors because there's a lot of fear and grief and all of those things, and the assurance that God has known a child even before birth, especially for folks who have miscarriages or something. It's powerful. Outside of Harry Potter and the Bible, in this podcast, I definitely talk about Lord of the Rings a lot. That's pretty obvious, as Kay has alluded to. But also D&D.
That's interesting, because reading one of these texts, I definitely had a Lord of the Rings thought and then decided to leave it for you to make. So I guess we'll see when we get there if that happens.
Yeah, you might have to make it this time. But also D&D, because we're on a Harry Potter themed D&D adventure, and it's my first real D&D adventure, and so I talk about it a lot because it also is connected because it has to do with Harry Potter and thinking about the origins of Harry Potter, because it's back at when the founders were first creating Hogwarts. Yeah. What did you put for your
For my what?
In the podcast, but not necessarily Harry Potter or the Bible?
The general chaos that my cat has been known to cause occasionally comes up. She is currently napping, so she is, helping the podcast that way by reminding us to Sabbath and rest.
Mm-hmm. There was some not fan fiction, but some other story that you, for a while, were referencing a lot, but I don't remember what it was called.
I try to sell people on Diane Duane's Young Wizard series a lot.
Yeah, you don't have as much of a, this is my go-to outside of these two things. You have a greater variety than I do, and I just have
I think I've mentioned Discworld a few times. That would
maybe
not be
that's
a surprise.
it.
Yeah. You would like Discworld.
That you've told me before.
Yes. I think Granny Weatherwax would be an important figure in your life.
Anyway, back to our originally scheduled programming.
Yes. Our next reading is from Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 1 through 14. Ezekiel is given a vision by God of a valley of dry bones coming to life as a metaphor for what God will do for the Israelites. We have actually heard this reading recently in a previous episode.
I was thinking that we had.
Yeah.
So a theme for this one that I noticed this time was restoration after violence. So after the Battle of Hogwarts, of course, there's a lot of fan fiction, and I would love to read more fan fiction. So if you know of it, send it our way. But restoration after violence, what does it look like to restore Hogwarts after so much violence has occurred there? But I think also in Half-Blood Prince, we hear of Harry's initial time with the Dursleys after Order of the Phoenix and the fight at the Ministry of Magic and Sirius's death, that Harry is just laying catatonic in his bed until Dumbledore shows up. And he needs the time at the Weasleys, and he needs community and people that know at least some semblance of what he's going through in order to have any hope of recovering from that violence. And we see this particularly because he doesn't get that for most of the summer in Order of the Phoenix.
Right.
And it's really problematic, and it comes out in really unhelpful ways for him. And so this Half-Blood Prince is getting better at caring for Harry in the midst of his grief.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, in verse 1, this story of the Valley of Dry Bones is like a battleground from a war, right? There was a big fight, and there were just so many people who were killed that you couldn't necessarily bury them all. You couldn't give them all resting places. And we have those throughout the world, particularly from World War II and from the Vietnam War and the Korean Wars. I think a lot of times my go-to is the Battle of Hogwarts, but this time I was thinking about the giants in the mountains when Hagrid and Madame Maxime are sent by Dumbledore to talk with the giants and try to woo them to the side of the Order of the Phoenix. And they're in the middle of doing this, and then there's a big fight one night, and there's a new head Gurg, and the old one's no longer alive. Slightly graphic depiction.
Yeah.
But just like that, the way that fight between the giants leaves in this valley in the mountains dead giants and hurting giants, and they're kind of scattered around.
In verse 10, we know that this is not a spell. This is a prophecy. You can tell because A, Ezekiel is proclaiming the will of God to the world, which is what prophesying is, and B, because it's not a weird combination of Latin and Greek.
Although, depending on which translation you use, it might be.
Yeah, I suppose. Not to mention the fact that, I don't know, do the words used for the spells change in the different translations of the Harry Potter books? Like in Spanish, do they use the Greek words instead of the Latin or something?
No, okay. They don't really change.
I know that there is a Latin translation of at least the first Harry Potter book somewhere.
Yeah, I know.
There are nerds like that.
Well, and there are translations of all of them into a lot of different languages, including Latin and Greek.
Well, modern Greek. Hebrew, I don't know if they've done biblical Greek.
I don't think they've done biblical Greek.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think, in general, the spells themselves change. I think they leave the spells as they are.
And then when we reach verse 12, because this is a vision that is a metaphor, I want to be clear that God is not actually talking about Inferi here. Like, God did not create Inferi. No, this is a vision that is a metaphor, and therefore there are no Inferi, like, wandering around in the desert in front of Ezekiel. Yeah, okay. Just so we're clear.
That's hilarious. Well done.
You're welcome. I try to be helpful.
You are so helpful. In verse 13, when God says, "And you shall know that I am the becoming one when I open your graves and bring you up from your graves." My, of course, go-to is, you can't actually bring the dead back to life. Like, not possible in the magical world. I know, but God can do all sorts of things. Well, and Harry's all sorts of complicated and exceptions to every freaking rule, because otherwise how does he win?
Yes.
But then I was thinking about it and wondering, could you untransfigure Crouch Sr. from being a bone back into being a human? Barty Crouch Jr. transfigures Barty Crouch Sr. into being a bone, but then Barty Crouch, like, transfigurations aren't permanent necessarily. Like, things could, like, turn back into whatever they, like, originally were. And so, like, did Barty Crouch Sr. actually die if he was just transfigured into a bone, or like could he be untransfigured from a bone? And if he's untransfigured, then would he live? And if he untransfigures while he's buried, then is he buried alive?
Ew.
But is he actually dead? What if he's not dead and then like he's buried low enough that he can just like kind of dig himself out because it's freshly turned dirt, so it's not like it's hard packed?
I think what you're saying is that Crouch is now Schrodinger's Crouch.
Simultaneously a bone and alive at the same time?
Basically.
Gotcha. Our next reading is Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 14 through 20. God promises Israel mercy, safety, victory, and community in their covenant with God. So a theme for this passage is restoration, a second chance, a new opportunity, which is the vision that is kind of cast in the epilogue of Deathly Hallows. But without the work, it won't actually happen, and we don't actually see the magical world doing the work they need to do for that restoration. Hence, Cursed Child happens, and the magical world is not prepared to do things differently, and so there's the possibilities of evil coming back in similar ways. But Zephaniah is setting this vision of restoration that could actually come about, but also requires cooperation with God and participation with God in making it come about.
Yeah.
As we dive into the verses, in verse 14, we hear, "Sing aloud, O daughter Zion, shout, O Israel, rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter Jerusalem." This is where it was. As I mentioned before with Miriam, this is one of those like celebrations of utter and complete joy in the midst of even exile or destruction or despair. There's still this space for hope and for restoration. And so that's the space that they occupy in Order of the Phoenix when Harry isn't convicted by the Wizengamot for casting Expecto Patronum, right? The Ginny and the Weasley twins are dancing around and just so exuberant. And I almost think there's more exuberance because they're in the context of a world of despair, and that gives more space there's more need for joy and for that sort of experience.
And then when we reach verse 17, I should point out that while there will be singing, they will probably not be singing Weasley is our king, because only God is king, obviously. I'm sure there are other songs they'll sing.
In verse 19, we also hear of the call to gather the outcasts, and that reminded me of Dumbledore's army, especially after Order of the Phoenix. Like, Dumbledore's army is pretty popular during Order of the Phoenix, but afterwards it really is more of the outcasts and the outsiders, aside from the trio, who are actually probably insiders, even though they feel like they're outsiders. I think they're probably more the popular kids than they are willing to admit. But for Neville in particular and Luna, it's a gathering of the outcasts, but a gathering of the outcasts where shame becomes praise and renown. And that is especially true for Neville, who, like, we see in Deathly Hallows being renowned and being a leader in the fight. And it is Neville and Ginny and Luna who are leading that fight and that resistance.
Yeah. Yeah, when I looked at verse 19, I noticed that those who have mobility issues are not said to be healed, but instead are saved and are to have their shame turned into praise. They are fine the way they are. They are created by God the way they are. God loves them as they are. It is from the treatment of others and the shame inflicted on them by others that they need saving from. That's interesting to me because I think it was Brene Brown that pointed out that shame is one of the few emotions that it doesn't come from within yourself. It has to do with how others treat you and how you are perceived by them and how you understand that perception. And I think this is maybe a verse that Ms. Rowling could have benefited from as she considered how to treat people with various kinds of disabilities in the books. Yeah.
I think we hear that a lot from the disability communities, that it's ableism that leaves people out. It's not the disabilities themselves.
Yeah. Our next reading is from Jonah, chapter 1, verse 1, through chapter 2, verse 1. Jonah, attempting to flee from God's mission for him, gets scared by the weather and ends up in the belly of a very large fish. Again, possibly one of those stories that was a little difficult to sum up.
Yes, and also a hilarious story.
Yes.
So one of the main themes for the entire book of Jonah, but especially for this beginning part, is the unexpectedly faithful people. Generally, when we think of prophets, they're the ones that are supposed to be the faithful ones. And in Jonah, it's actually Jonah the prophet is the least faithful of all of the people. And the sailors end up being the faithful ones. And so I was thinking about who is the unexpectedly faithful in Harry Potter, and Snape is the one who is unexpectedly faithful, right? Everyone has discounted him, no one trusts him, and yet throughout all of it, he is faithful to the promise he made to Dumbledore.
Yes. Also Regulus. Don't forget Regulus.
Regulus also, I think, is faithful, but I guess unexpectedly faithful, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Sirius never knew. Yeah.
Yeah, which is sad.
When we reach verse 2, and Jonah runs away, I've got to say, I wouldn't want this job either. Nineveh is an enormous city. They make the point later that it takes, 9 days to walk across the city or something like that?
3 days.
3 days? Okay, still lots. It takes quite a while to walk across it. And if you show up and you announce that God is angry with them and in a gigantic city, I don't think that would make you very popular. I think Jonah is probably worried about getting tarred and feathered or possibly killed by a mob when he shows up there and does this. And so, I'm not saying running away was the right thing to do, but I get it.
Yeah. Well, and Nineveh is historically and in the future known to be an enemy and one who will oppress
they wouldn't be thrilled to see him at all. So.
And so that's also a part of Jonah's I don't want to save them so that they oppress us.
Yeah. Yeah. They wouldn't like me if I showed up saying God was happy with them. So let's not go there.
Yeah.
So I have to wonder, would you want to go into the Slytherin common room and announce that cunning and ambition are bad and wrong and also all purebloods are evil? I don't think that's going to work out for you either. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that would probably not.
Or
that's not exactly what God is.
And telling them, don't you dare feed people. Don't you dare. Nope, you have to betray everyone. Come on, let's go.
To be fair, that's not exactly what God is telling Jonah to say.
Well, no.
But, yeah. Fair point. When I was thinking about this verse, I was thinking about also being asked to go to Nineveh, and that being actually like serious, being asked to go have a friendly chat with Snape.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah, exactly. And then in verse 13, I kind of like to point out when I tell the story to people that the sailors did not just immediately throw Jonah into the sea right away like he suggested. That was not their first reaction. Instead, they decided to try to get to land like they had been doing and, put in some extra effort. And I like to point that out because maybe killing someone, which is what they probably assumed throwing him into the sea would do, because wouldn't anyone, maybe killing someone isn't the answer to everything automatically. Is it, Dumbledore? I'm just saying.
Yeah. I also, when I was reading it this time, I was like, well, what if instead of just trying to get back to land, they had just done an about face and headed towards Nineveh? Like, I think that would have also calmed the sea.
Yeah, come to think of it, I don't know that Jonah actually explained that part.
Yeah, getting back to land doesn't, just gets them safety, but doesn't necessarily get Jonah back on track.
Yeah.
In the same way. Yeah. Well, and that's, the sailors, I just feel bad for the sailors, because they are, trying not to kill him, but ultimately, throw him over, like you said. But then they pray, and they're they cry out to God, "Please, God, we pray, do not let us perish on account of this man's life. Do not make us guilty of innocent blood. For you, O God, have done as it pleased you."
Yeah, God does not come off all that well in that. Yeah.
Yeah. Although, right, God doesn't actually kill anybody in this.
No.
But I was thinking about the ways that Harry went to great lengths to not let anyone in on what he was doing, so that blame for his death, when he thought he was just going to die, couldn't be given to anyone. Well, except Dumbledore, of course. But no one alive knew about that, so it would have just died with Harry. Yeah, but that same going to great lengths to protect and to keep the blame from being passed along.
Yeah.
Our next passage is Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 through 4 and 9 through 11. Isaiah, clothed in the garments of salvation, announces the year of God's favor and all the things God will do in that year. So a theme for this passage is receiving double good after hardship. God names that the Israelites have experienced tons of hardship, and so the good that God will bring is double. I think that's probably how it felt for Harry after 10 years of living with the Dursleys and living in an abusive situation, that then it took to go to Hogwarts was this doubly or triple-fold blessing until he became the child sacrifice, but it took him years to find out about that, and so there's just this short time where he is getting extra blessings because of the harm that he suffered.
Yeah.
So in the first verse of this passage, we hear that the Spirit of God is upon Isaiah because God has anointed Isaiah. They have sent Isaiah to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, like Hermione in Half-Blood Prince when Ron starts dating Lavender, to proclaim liberty to the captives like Luna and Griphook and Ollivander in the Malfoy dungeon in Deathly Hallows, and release to the prisoners like Sirius and Hagrid, particularly in Chamber of Secrets, but before Sirius breaks free in Prisoner of Azkaban.
Yeah.
All sorts of good news for Harry Potter characters.
Absolutely. For the record, the Lord of the Rings reference that I was expecting you to make, but you seem to have skipped, was in verse 3, I think, where Isaiah briefly talks about the Oaks of Righteousness, or compares them to Oaks of Righteousness. And I said to myself, why doesn't Harry Potter have Ents? Come on.
Seriously, Ents would be amazing.
Yeah. Or at least Dryads or something, And then when we reach verse 4, we hear of the devastation across many generations. And it occurs to me that after book 7, Harry and company and, a couple of generations worth of people have not just 2 wars with Voldemort to clean up after, but also cleaning up the mess that Grindelwald left behind. And since all of those messes were just left there for them to deal with, I kind of wonder if maybe there were evil wizards before him that also had messes left. They have a lot of work to do.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like us right now with all of the wars.
Yeah.
That we've been in. Yeah. Just a side note, so we skip over verses 5 through 8. The part that we leave out is the part where, like, God says, you're going to become the upper class, the oppressors, right? Strangers shall stand and feed your flocks. Foreigners shall till your land and dress your vines. Really? Really?
The kind of
God.
thing that maybe we should be paying attention to.
Yeah. So that's left out of this, but it felt like, and so everybody becomes like the Malfoys? No, thank you. Just as a side note.
And yet, so accurate.
Right?
I mean, on the one hand, no thank you, but on the other hand, so accurate.
Yeah. In verse 10, which we do actually read, we hear from Isaiah, I will greatly rejoice in the becoming one. My whole being shall exult in my God, for they have clothed me with the garments of salvation. They have covered me with the robe of righteousness. And it reminded me of how Hogwarts clothes the students. So they bring their original, like, robes and stuff, but then magically, once they're sorted into the appropriate houses, Hogwarts kind of magics their clothing to be the ties for their house and that sort of thing.
And then in verse 11, we get this lovely moment of God as gardener, which is a recurring theme throughout the Bible. And I like to think of this as God having a Professor Sprout moment. And that makes me wonder, you know, we have tried to sort the various Bible characters into the houses over the years. And I think we even had a brief discussion once about trying to sort Jesus, but we couldn't really sort where
and the Gospels.
Jesus should go. Yes, and oh, that was a good one. But have we ever tried to sort God? Is God a Hufflepuff? I think God might be a Hufflepuff.
I think you always want them all to be Hufflepuff.
Not all of them, just the ones that aren't evil.
Just because God is a gardener doesn't mean God is Hufflepuff.
Being a Hufflepuff
Neville
and being
is a
evil
good gardener.
Really hard.
Yeah, but Neville is a good gardener and very caring and a Gryffindor.
Okay, that's fair.
I'm just saying.
I'm just saying God could be a Hufflepuff. It's an option.
It is an option. I think God is all of them and none of them at once, just like with gender.
What if God is only 3 of them? Because, you know, God is Trinity.
Characteristics are not the same as persons of the Trinity. Something to look forward to in our Holy Trinity episode this year.
I'm not saying that each person of the Trinity is one. I'm just saying that if God was going to be a certain number of houses, I think 3 is a decent shot.
It's true, but I think then you'd have to, like, leave one out. And I think that God is actually cunning and resourceful, so you can't just automatically leave out Slytherins.
Right. Slytherins are not naturally evil.
True.
Although, let's be honest, if we're talking about which house is the scariest when they go evil, I think Hufflepuff is right up there.
Oh, for sure. Evil Hufflepuff is the worst. Definitely.
Our next reading is from the book of Daniel, chapter 3, verses 1 through 29. King Nebuchadnezzar throws Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into a fiery furnace for refusing to worship his golden statue. God rescues them, and the king declares no one is to commit blasphemy against God on pain of death.
So, funny story. For a long time, I don't know how I got it in my head, but I always thought this was a bedtime story.
Yeah, this is included in a lot of children's picture Bibles.
Maybe that's why.
A lot of them.
Yeah, which is kind of weird and creepy. This was definitely
one of those Bible stories I heard very young.
Yeah, which is, like, weird and creepy because it's, like, it has some interesting, like, easily bad theology type things.
But
not necessarily, but, like...
It's very, It's very much the witch burning Hansel and Gretel in a furnace kind of story.
Right? Anyway, so thinking about it as a bedtime story reminded me of the Tales of Beedle the Bard or the Grimm's fairy tales, where there are some pretty disturbing stories, but they're told like they should just be regular old bedtime stories. But this story, part of what this story is like satire, right? It's over-the-top ridiculousness. If you read it, there's repetition of certain phrases of like all of the people that Nebuchadnezzar calls together, of all of the instruments they're told to use, and it repeats in such a way that like in a storytelling way, it's supposed to be funny and it's supposed to be super over-the-top and ridiculous. I think...
Which I will get to in a minute.
Most of the time when I've heard this read in worship, it's not read as funny. It's just read like every other reading. But I think it does a lot better when you have people who can like help point out the ridiculousness of it.
Right. One of the things about the Easter Vigil is that it's not just about reading these stories. It's actually about bringing them to life. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things you can do for this story is to make it clear that all of that repetition is supposed to be ridiculous.
Yeah.
Ridiculous.
Ha! Ridiculous. Yeah, and I think that's one of the gifts of these stories is that you don't actually have to read the stories word for word to tell the stories.
Yeah.
Like I know people who have done like children's books that tell the story of creation and that sort of thing. So you could I think it would actually be pretty cool to somehow tie it in and just tell a story as if like the trio were encountering we're like journeying through history and through the Bible and like encountering these stories and what they would do and stuff. I think that would be really cool and really fun. Kind of like we do with Christmas pageants sometimes, but
like they actually turned out to be Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Right? What would that look like? That'd be so fun. Anyway, so along the themes of satire and over-the-top ridiculousness, this fits really well with the Weasley twins and the ways that they, particularly in Half-Blood Prince and Deathly Hallows, once it's acknowledged that Voldemort is back, the way they go over the top to like poke fun at things and to bring levity into what is a very deep and scary time for folks. And so thinking about things like, poo, and the way that they advertise that to specifically poke at the fear that people have against Voldemort or who. Yeah. They're the pokers of this whole thing. So in verse 1, we hear that King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits and whose width was 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And so thinking about this statue and the way that it impacts and the prominence it's given in the story, of course, makes me think of different statues or perhaps fountains in the magical world. It will surprise nobody that I thought of the Fountain of Magical Brethren and the way that it creates a narrative. King Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue creates a particular narrative. The Fountain of Magical Brethren and then the Magic of Might fountain statue thing at the Ministry of Magic both create a narrative. Or even the statue at Godric's Hollow that is one part war memorial for Muggles and one part Lily, James, and baby Harry for magical people. That each of those statues tells a different story of the community and of the people that encounter it, for better and for worse.
Speaking of stories you tend to come back to in Harry Potter.
Truth. Although that's more of a thing I come back to than a story.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
The story that the statue tells.
Back to the Fountain of Magical Brethren a lot. Yeah. It's been a while. It's good to revisit things.
Yes, so in verse 5, we get the first of one of my favorite of the repetitious bits of the story, which is the list of instruments. When you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble. And this story makes great use of repeated phrases as a storytelling method, which Emily talked about earlier. And this particular phrase, and also I guess the others too, I would love to hear them said in a chorus of high, squeaky voices. And I think if we're going to go with a Harry Potter theme, I think Moaning Myrtle's voice would be an excellent choice for that. Because it helps make that whole bit even more ridiculous of the constant repetition.
Ridiculous!
And yes, and the list of the advisors for the king and the musical instruments, and all of it said, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble.
Now you sound like Winky.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about that as a comparison too. Not just as one voice, but like there would be a whole little Greek chorus in the back corner that would, every time you got to one of those phrases, they would jump in and take over.
That's funny. That would be really cool. I went and watched the Des Moines Symphony is doing the Harry Potter series every year. And so they do the soundtrack to it. And then you watch the movie all together. And they did the third year this year, Prisoner of Azkaban, and I went to it. And they had a choir in the corner. Because they don't get used a ton. Right. But they get used a fair amount. And so it was kind of cool to have them there. That's what that reminded me of.
Cool. And then when we reach verse 25, I have to ask myself, is this their special burning people to death furnace? Like, does King Nebuchadnezzar just have one in his basement? That kind of sounds like what he'd do, actually. But a furnace big enough for burning 4 grown men alive and allowing them room to walk around in would be huge. And yes, there were 4 of them because there was Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and the divine person that was protecting them, presumably God. So that would be enormous. So that seems like a lot of space to take up for a furnace that you only burn people to death in. Does it also have other purposes, I hope? I suppose it's not that much better than keeping around a hat whose only job is to sort students once a year and occasionally produce a sword at useful moments.
And come up with a song.
Yes, for sorting the students, not for producing the sword. That
right, it would be pretty inconvenient to produce
Yes.
a song and a sword at the same time. Oh, you're like, while you're singing the song, the hat's singing the song. Oh,
That
you're
sounds like a
trying to hide.
strength and weakness of a D&D item. Like, you have this magic hat, and sometimes it can produce a sword, but when it produces a sword, it's also going to sing a song, and will reveal your location to all of the enemies nearby.
Also, I'd like to point out that you made the D&D reference this time.
I did.
Well done. As we continue at the end in verse 29, Nebuchadnezzar is converted to, like, realizing he was wrong and that, you know, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is in fact a wonderful God. And so then says, "Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." And it's just one of those times when I just roll my eyes at King Nebuchadnezzar, because even when he converts and is, like, convicted of the ways he has been wrong and been harmful, he's still wrong in his approach, right? Like, he shouldn't, you don't require people to believe a certain thing or to do a certain thing around faith. That's just wrong. And so it's like when Fudge goes all in, he's still wrong. Whether he's all in on letting Harry off scot-free because of the hover charm that Dubby uses, or punishing him, trying to punish him super drastically for protecting himself and Dudley from the Dementors. Either way, Fudge is not doing the thing the right way. He's going too far, too drastically, because he doesn't get how to not do that.
Yeah, like, I want to give King Nebuchadnezzar a little bit of credit for, you know, if you're going to convert, by all means, do it with enthusiasm. No, this is not the direction you want to be going. Murder bad. Yeah.
And now we finally arrive at the New Testament. So in the Easter Vigil, there's this long part of telling these stories from the Hebrew Bible, and then usually there's liturgical stuff that happens, and then the reading of Romans 6 verses 3 through 11. If this were an actual Easter Vigil, there'd be like a pause and liturgy stuff happening, and then we'd get to this reading. But in this reading, Paul proclaims that because our baptism unites us with Christ in his death, then it also must unite us with Christ in the resurrection. So a theme for this passage is newness of life. The way things shift, and there's a whole new perspective on life and the world. And so I was wondering if that ever happens in the magical world, right? Like they just keep messing up. We see this in Cursed Child even, that bad things happen and then they change like surface level stuff, but they never seem to make the systemic changes they need to prevent a future Voldemort from happening or Grindelwald, right? They keep having
that's
evil
not realistic
wizards.
At all.
Yeah, I don't know what we're talking about. We don't have people who are doing terrible things in the world. Not at all. All the time. And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 6, we hear that from Paul that we know that our old self was crucified with Christ so that the body of sin might be destroyed and we might no longer be enslaved to sin. And so thinking once again, I really do talk about house elves a lot. It's because we talk, like, language around slavery is actually quite common in the Bible, and so I think that's part of it. But wondering about the house elves as the epitome of being enslaved to sin, both because they are in a very real way enslaved within the system of sin.
And two sinful people.
And that system also enslaves magical folk to sin because oppressing others is sin, and so they're enslaved in the role of oppressor, and it's different forms of enslavement and certainly has a different impact on everybody and a much worse impact on house elves, but there's this way that everybody is wrapped up and caught up and enslaved into this system of sin.
Yeah. In verse 6, we talk a bit about Jesus being crucified, and this word for the spell crucio comes from the same root as the word crucify or crucifixion. And the spell obviously produces horrific pain. It's not really surprising that one might be changed or transformed after going through something like that, even without the whole rising from the dead bit that Jesus did. I think the transformation here is not just about rising from the dead, but it's also about having gone through a transformational experience, which pain can be. Not necessarily in a good way, but it does change you.
Well, I mean, think about Neville's parents, right?
Yeah.
As an example of that. It's, yeah, intense amounts of pain don't always change for the best.
Yeah.
In verse 9, we hear, "We know that Christ, being raised from the dead, will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over Christ." So really, all Voldemort had to do was become a Christian, and then he'd be fine on the death front, because that was like his whole goal, was to avoid death, and so just
But
follow
we are
Christ.
United with Jesus in his death.
Well, yes, but then death no longer has
united
dominion over Christ, and therefore over us.
But
and
that
therefore,
doesn't mean we don't die. He was going for full-on not dying.
Minor detail.
Yeah, I read that verse, and I thought to myself, whereas we are presuming that Harry, post-return from the train station of, purgatory, or whatever we're calling it, is not actually immortal, and will still die again at some point, much like we assume that Lazarus did at some point. So, Look, Harry isn't Jesus. Yay!
Woo!
We do try to hammer that home on occasion. Our final reading for the Easter Vigil is from the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verses 1 through 18. Mary Magdalene, first to return to Jesus' tomb after the Sabbath, discovers the body is gone and informs the disciples, who are confused and then go home. While she weeps by the tomb, Jesus appears to her and sends her out as the first apostle to proclaim the gospel of Christ's resurrection.
So one of the themes for this passage is the difference between belief and understanding, right? There's people believed, but that doesn't mean that they fully understood what was going on. And so thinking about Voldemort, believed the prophecy about him and Harry, but didn't fully understand it. In Voldemort's case, understanding it might have made a difference in what he actually did. And in Harry's case, he understood it, and so his belief in the prophecy came from understanding it more fully, and he was then able to use that information to fight Voldemort more effectively.
Yeah.
I think it was more effective. Anyway.
No, it was. It's just hovering slightly closer to Gnosticism than I would like, but yeah.
I mean, I don't think we need to understand, I think in the Harry Potter world, it's more helpful to understand, and in our world, and in the world of faith.
This is how faith and the rest of the world are different.
Yeah, it's not as much about understanding the exact how this happened. It's like we were saying with the earlier stories, right? They're not the exact how of what happened. It's not that it took God 7 24-hour periods to create everything that is. It's a story, the stories tell the why of it. The why God creates and the why we exist, not the science or the historical facts of it.
Yeah.
In this first verse, we hear that early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. And thinking about the locket Horcrux in the cave and the darkness and the scariness, but particularly when Voldemort goes to check on it, there's this ominous sense about it, and I imagine Mary Magdalene would also have an ominous sense because of the way that Jesus died, but also the darkness and the unknowingness, and something has been disrupted or disturbed, but it's not clear what or how. Yeah.
And tragically, I'm not really sure that she would have had access to coffee, so she might not have been properly caffeinated.
Probably not.
So
maybe.
It probably would have helped with the whole figuring out what was going on.
Yeah, I imagine it would have helped. I don't think she would have had access to it, because I think it didn't come to Germany until the 1500s, which means that...
And it was definitely invented by Muslims.
Yeah. Geniuses.
Absolutely. Thank goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then when we reach verse 11, the disciples just leave Mary standing there, weeping outside the tomb, just standing there, without apparently saying anything to her at all, and then they go home. Thanks, dudes. That is a level of emotional cluelessness that not even Harry, who had to have Jo's crying explained to him using small words by Hermione, a level of emotional cluelessness that not even Harry could aspire to.
Or Ron. Ron was even more clueless than Harry about that.
And Ron would not do this. If Ron saw someone standing next to the tomb weeping, I think Ron would probably stay with them and then say, look, come with me and I'll take you to my mom and she'll feed you.
Right.
Yeah.
In verse 16, finally there's kind of this recognition of who people are. Jesus has called Mary woman a couple times, but then it's not until Jesus says to Mary, Mary, and she turns to him and says to him in Hebrew, Rabboni, which means teacher. And it's the impact of the actual names and titles and nicknames that people have for each other. So thinking about the Marauders and the way that they called each other Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, and that if they were having trouble recognizing, even like I think if they were under the Imperius curse, calling someone by that nickname would, I think, be a jolt that might kick them out of like whatever trance they were in. But I also think there's the power of the title, and so thinking about Dubby when he's buried and then Harry writes on his stone, "Here lies Dubby, a free elf," and the power of that as Dubby's title is really impactful. Yeah. Dubby.
And then in verse 17, we hear Jesus sort of promote the disciples to being his brothers. And he calls them his brothers, which I think
siblings.
Is the first time in this gospel that he's done that.
I think he does siblings, though. Like, I think it's a...
Oh, yes. No, you're right. It is a sibling relationship that he's talking about. It's not gender specific in the Greek. But it does make me wonder, was Harry ever officially... I mean, he got a sweater, yes, but was he ever officially welcomed as an honorary Weasley?
I mean, he should have taken Ginny's last name is really what should have happened. You know he didn't, but he should have.
Yes, he should. Oh, goodness. Just make all the kids Weasleys, absolutely.
Yeah, I think he was. Yeah. I think the sweater is how they do it, not with words, though. No. Yeah, I think the wedding would have been the, like, words, or the, like, pre-wedding conversation with the in-law, the future in-laws.
Oh, goodness. How many older brothers does Ginny have to threaten Harry if he...
I mean, okay,
I
Harry, think they would actually all know
and
better.
We're going to go down the line, and so you just sit here in this chair, and we'll, yeah.
No way, I think every single one would know better than to try that for Ginny. Like,
yeah, that's
she
true. Ginny would do
slay
the threatening
them
on her own part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
except maybe the twins. The twins might have to get a brief lesson from Ginny in the importance of bat bogey hexes.
Actually, I think that Percy would be the one most likely to ignore that. Like, I think the twins really get Ginny in a way that...
Yeah, that's
because Ginny has learned from them, but I think Percy is still probably pompous enough to, like...
Or just wasn't around.
At least say, like, Harry, I need to, like, have a conversation with you, and Ginny just, like, gives him a withering stare, and he's like, congratulations, I'm looking forward to the wedding. It's gonna be great.
How many sweaters does Harry end up with? Gracious.
I mean, one a year, right?
Yes, and then plus, like, I would imagine that he might have sweaters that aren't Weasley sweaters, and so, like, does he have one cabinet for his regular sweaters, and then there's, like, an extra special cabinet for all the Weasley sweaters?
I mean, I would probably stop buying sweaters once I caught the pattern of getting a Weasley sweater every Christmas. Yeah. It's like, my college roommate has gotten me a nativity every year.
Aw.
Since college, and when I was on internship, I, like, let people know. I didn't let people know that I was collecting, but I, like, talked about it, and so got a couple extra nativities, and since then I haven't, aside from this podcast, haven't told anybody about
because
the
otherwise
nativity
you'll wind up
collection
with more nativities than you have room for.
Because I'd get a ton, and I actually really love that it's a thing that I get from Steph, and not from a whole bunch of other people. So, dear listeners, please don't send us nativities, but yeah, it's those special things where you're like, no, from now on, for the rest of Harry's life, unless it's a particular sweater, he's set for sweaters because of the Weasleys.
Although, I would say, please don't send us actual physical nativities, but if you see any nativity memes, or, like, Harry Potter themed nativity pictures, we would be totally up for receiving those.
Yeah, that would be fun.
Those would be fun.
Those would be cool. Just not physical things. Yeah. We might even put them in our blog post. Well, thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we discuss Harry Potter connections to the scripture readings for the rest of the beginning of the season of Easter.
This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Roloff and Emily Ewan. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and WordPress, all at HPATCHURCH. Or contact us at hpatchurch@gmail.com. This season, we're also putting our episodes on YouTube, where you can listen and see subtitles. So make sure you let your friends know and search for us.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. Special shout out to Aiden, who recommended us on Facebook.
Thank you, Aiden.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.